So I'm not sure if you noticed, but we recently passed a pretty momentous day in the history of cartoons. I know, the year is moving so fast we sometimes forget about these milestones of remembrance. Yes, it was in fact just a couple of short weeks ago, on March 6th of 2017, that Squidward Tentacles accidentally froze himself for 2,000 years in the freezer of the Krusty Krab. Okay, so maybe I overplayed the intro just a little bit. If you have no idea what I'm talking about, I'm describing the events of the Season 1 episode of SpongeBob SquarePants SB-129, where exactly what I just described happens. Squidward accidentally freezes himself for 2,000 years, he messes around with a time machine, and hilarity ensues. But with all the internet discussion and memes about this episode that popped up around the 6th of March this year, and it was mostly memes, I'm not gonna lie to you, I got to thinking, nature is really weird, and there are some really tough animals out there that can survive practically anything. With that in mind, could a creature like Squidward actually survive being frozen for an extended period of time and then reanimated like we see in the episode? So the way this show usually works is we take a popular fan theory and then take a look at clues in the show to see how well they hold up. But this time, we're gonna do things a little differently. This time, it's the show itself that's providing us with the theory to analyze. And we're going to examine this by diving into a big old ocean full of science. And we're going to start by taking a look at who else but Squidward the octopus himself. Yes, you heard right. Squidward the octopus, not the squid. If you're a longtime SpongeBob fan, this may be old news to you. But to the surprise of a lot of people, Squidward is not actually the same species as his namesake. This has been confirmed multiple times through interviews with SpongeBob creator Steven Hillenburg, as well as by Squidward himself in episodes like The Play's the Thing or Patrick the Game. In retrospect, this makes a lot of sense, since Squidward bears a resemblance to an octopus rather than anything else. Well, except for the fact that he only has 6 tentacles. Hillenburg states that the choice to make Squidward a hextopus rather than an octopus was motivated mainly by the fact that 6 tentacles was easier to animate. It also made Squidward's general design a little less busy. Of course, now I have gripes with the naming conventions of everything in the show involving Squidward. Like, in the episode Love That Squid, Squidward dates another octopus named Squilvia. What are the odds that 2 octopi are both going to have squid-based pun names? And furthermore, why is the title of the episode— got a little off track there, sorry. But the fact that Squidward is an octopus is an important distinction to make in this situation. While there may be a host of similarities between squids and octopi, seeing as they're both cephalopods, things can get a bit more complicated when we break them down further into different species of each, which could prove useful further down the line for our purposes today. As for the theory itself, this episode pretty much covers the specifics. I mean, ignoring all of the cartoon logic that happens in SpongeBob all the time. Squidward is frozen solid after locking himself in a freezer and remaining there for 2,000 years. And finally re-emerging and being thawed on March 6th of the year 4017. He's then able to function like nothing happened. Now obviously this sounds ridiculous, but there actually is a precedent for certain types of animals to withstand brutally cold conditions. One of the most impressive cases of surviving comes from the microanimal the tardigrade, also known as the water bear, which is a much cuter name, which are microscopic organisms that are known as the most resilient animals ever. Firstly, they've been known to survive in the vacuum of space. And secondly, they've also been known to be capable of withstanding temperatures as low as 1 Kelvin, which is about -458 degrees Fahrenheit, or -272 degrees Celsius. Though that said, we're not talking about being completely frozen solid. I mean, at 1 Kelvin we should be, but tardigrades are tough. They can get through anything. Thankfully, there actually are some animals that have the amazing ability to essentially be frozen solid and then reanimated. Unfortunately, this ability hasn't been found in humans yet. However, certain species of frog, like the wood frog, other amphibians, and microscopic beings have been documented as being effectively frozen and then brought back to life, going on to live their lives without any acknowledgement of the brilliance of their black magic. So if this is possible with these animals, most of which are cold-blooded just like the octopus, is there any possibility that Squidward might have a similar ability, allowing himself to survive being frozen solid? So, ocean sciences are pretty crazy. I say this because despite all of the amazing technology and resources we have available to us today, we know so little about our own oceans. And that's not a slight at the world's oceanographers or marine biologists or other ocean scientists, which clearly I'm not one of. We know so little about them because of how massive they are. I mean, yes, the ocean covers about 70% of the Earth, but it's easy to forget that the ocean isn't just the surface. It's also incredibly deep. I'm talking like 14-year-old Jacob sitting in his room wearing all black writing edgy poetry deep. The average depth of the ocean is about 3.7 kilometers deep, or about 2.1 miles. But the deepest part of the ocean, the Challenger Deep located in the Marianas Trench, that is about 11 kilometers or 6.8 miles deep. And just for reference here, Mount Everest is only about 5.5 miles tall. If it sat at the bottom of the Challenger Deep, it wouldn't even come close to breaching the surface of the water. So with that in mind, is it really that surprising to hear that we might know less about our own oceans than things like our solar system? 12 humans have been to the moon. Only 3 have been to the bottom of the Challenger Deep. And about 95% of our oceans remain completely unexplored. So other than sharing all of these incredibly cool and sobering stats with you, why am I telling you all of this? Because the ocean is terrifying and you should be terrified too. The Kraken? Cthulhu? Still distinct possibilities. Maybe. But I'm also telling you this because discoveries are being made all the time about the weird, amazing stuff that lurks below us. And I'm not a marine biologist, so take everything I say with a grain of salt. Because there may be new discoveries popping up someday that change the nature of this episode. So let's start with some basic stuff about the octopus. The average lifespan of an octopus is between 3 and 5 years. So obviously there's no chance of Squidward living 2,000 years on his own, but is freezing himself really the best option here? Well, first, what kind of octopus is Squidward? Based on some observations, we can make a pretty educated guess. If we take a look at Squidward's habitat, we can assume that he's what's called a common octopus, which, unsurprisingly, is the most common species in the world. They generally live on the sea floor and not usually more than 200 meters away from the surface in tropical areas. All of this information checks out in the show. The general setting of Bikini Bottom tells us that we are indeed in a tropical environment. And we can definitively tell that Squidward lives close to the surface because the show isn't, pitch black. As light hits the ocean, the first 100 meters below are generally pretty well illuminated. But as we travel deeper, sunlight has a much harder time getting through, as by that point it's already mostly dispersed. And once we're about a kilometer deep, absolutely no sunlight makes its way there, resulting in the rest of the ocean being cloaked in complete darkness. So based on the fact that the characters in SpongeBob SquarePants can do things like see each other, not to mention that sometimes the animation also shows sun rays peeking through the water, that would suggest that Squidward and his pals live awfully close to sea level, much like the common octopus. But despite what SB-129 would have you believe, octopi are surprisingly sensitive to extreme cold temperatures. Since the octopus is a cold-blooded animal, its body temperature is determined by its surroundings. This is as opposed to warm-blooded animals like us who just have to maintain the same internal body temperature. So in order to function, most octopi need to live in relatively warm environments, with the common octopus preferring temperatures of about 16 degrees Celsius or 60 degrees Fahrenheit. Part of why the common octopus lives where it does is because the distribution of heat in the ocean works very much like light. Now that I think about it, the sun is pretty hot. It's almost as if they're actually related. As the light in the ocean fades, so does the heat, and the ocean can get real cold if you travel deep enough. So with that sensitivity to temperature established, what would happen if Squidward found himself in the position of being frozen solid? While the octopus can compensate for chilly conditions in some ways, don't expect Squidward going on any wacky time-traveling romps like he does in the episode anytime soon. As temperature decreases, it becomes much more difficult for cold-blooded animals to do things like live, as their chemical functions all begin to seize up. The lack of heat slows their circulatory system, which means that their blood distributes oxygen to their systems much more slowly, further restricting the abilities of its other vital organs. And we all know how that ends. However, there have been some discoveries that have shown that some species of Antarctic-based octopi have adapted to the cold over the course of the millions of years that separate them from their tropical brethren. And in short, the way they've done this is by reducing the amount of oxygen their proteins and vital organs need in order to continue, living. And this is despite having a very similar genetic makeup to the tropical octopi that prefer much warmer conditions. These cold-dwelling beasts have demonstrated an ability to survive in waters as cold as -2 degrees Celsius, or 35 degrees Fahrenheit. And while that is impressive, it's not exactly the extreme example we're looking for. Many cold-blooded animals are able to function in fluctuating heat conditions. Squidward being frozen solid is a completely different story. And unfortunately, as far as we know, octopi don't possess any sort of cryoprotectant abilities like our previously mentioned wood frogs. So Squidward freezing would actually be pretty similar to any other animal that would freeze to death. When something freezes to death, it's in large part because of its circulatory system completely ceasing its function. This is because blood cells are largely water, and when they're exposed to extreme cold, it can result in ice crystals forming in between the cells, resulting in the dehydration and freezing of the cells, frequently damaging them or destroying the cell membrane completely. This in turn results in a lack of oxygen being delivered to the rest of the creature's systems, which results in the death of all of those cells as well as the creature that's hosting them. And almost nothing we know is safe from this. Not the least of which Squidward, who, since he doesn't seem to be descended from any Antarctica-based octopi, would probably die when exposed to any temperature below freezing for an extended period of time. And when reanimation is attempted, well, you can thaw the body, but those cells aren't gonna regenerate. All in all, based on what we've seen here today, it doesn't look good for Squidward. Based on the biology of octopi, particularly in his own tropical species, Squidward doesn't seem like he'd be able to survive particularly cold temperatures, let alone a freezing one. And we're not even talking about being frozen solid or anything. I'm just talking about like if he lived in Canada. He would be super dead in the winter. Now it's true that we can't discount those Antarctic octopi, but they seem to be the exception more than the rule. I actually came across a fan theory a while ago that suggested that SB-129, particularly its ending, was actually a representation of Squidward's afterlife. It claims that Squidward was killed during the events of the episode when the time machine he was using malfunctioned and crushed him for the sake of a visual gag. And while I usually don't like to acknowledge they were dead all along theories, I gotta agree with this one. But it wasn't the time machine that killed Squidward, it was the act of freezing himself at all. Philip J. Fry, he is not. With that in mind, I'm going to rate the show's conspiracy of Squidward Tentacles surviving 2,000 years after being frozen solid 0.5 jellyfishing nets out of 5. But what do you think? Do you think Squidward could have survived freezing himself? How terrified of the ocean are you after watching this episode? And which character in SpongeBob SquarePants do you relate to the most? I feel like everybody in their life goes through this transition where they go from relating more to SpongeBob to relating more to Squidward. And the more I think about it, I think that transition might just be called adulthood. Be sure to leave us your thoughts in the comments, and also be sure to leave us any conspiracies you'd like us to do an episode on sometime in the future. Until then, be sure to like this video, and if you're new here, subscribe to channel Frederator. And also, don't forget to ring that little bell icon next to the subscribe button to become part of our notification squad and be notified of all sorts of awesome stuff, including more cartoon conspiracies. And remember, Frederator loves you.